Hi, so we will be working on an interviewing unit for the next week or so. So let's get started with talking about the art of the question. So I like this quote from Barbara Walsh, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter. She says, in interviewing, if you were sincere and the sources know that you have compassion, they're going to talk. A lot of the skill is just being open to what they have to say. And I can tell you that in all my years of working as a reporter and editor at the Paducah Sun, that when my sources knew that I cared and I was interested in what they were going to say, they were more willing to talk to me. If I went into an interview with a bad attitude or I was having a bad day, it just seemed like the whole interview went downhill and I didn't get the information I needed. Just remember that you can always do better with honey rather than vinegar. So what that means is the nicer you are, and, you still have to be tough, but if you are tough but fair and nice, you're going to get a better interview than someone who's combative. All right, so when we're thinking about what we're going to do for our interviews, first you have to come up with what story you want to do. Oftentimes, as beginning reporters, you will have an editor who will tell you, oh, hey, this event is happening on campus and we want you to go cover it. And you're like, okay, great. So I need to be this place at this time and I'm going to talk to these people. Straightforward. Other times, your editor will say, we heard about um, there have been a series of robberies in a specific building on campus, and we want you to find it out. So then you have to start to think about who would you talk to. In that case, you would probably need to talk to the chief of police, as well as tracking down people who've been affected by those crimes. So after you have your story idea, you have to come up with the people that you need for your interviews. How many sources do you need? That is a very good question. On breaking news stories, you may not get that many sources because you may only have maybe one or two main sources. Ideally, we usually say we want you to have three sources. The reason for that is because it gives a more balanced view. A one source story is asking for trouble. It's going to depend really on the story, on how many sources you'll need. So you don't just say every story has to have three sources. Sometimes you might need to have three. Sometimes you might have up to five. Other times you may have as many as 10 sources. So it varies by story. You also have to think about if you're going to do the interview on the phone, in person, by email, and I hesitate to say this, by text. You also then have to think about the photos, any type of graphic presentation for the web, and any type of broadcast presentation. So interviewing, really, all it comes down to is really and truly you are just having conversations with your sources. Your sources are the people you're going to talk to. Most of the stories you write, you will have to do interviews. You're going to have two different types of interview sources. Your primary sources are going to be the ones who have the authority over the documents, or the ones with the eyewitness info. They experience something firsthand. Secondary sources are going to be people who talk to the eyewitness or someone who talks to the police, etc. Generally, your best source is going to be someone who is directly involved in the situation. So we have to start to think about how you're going to identify potential sources. So let's just think about the story. If we had a story about like a lot of, like I said, robberies, break-ins, criminal activity in a building on campus, the people you probably need to talk to, again, like I said, would be the police chief or an investigating officer if he or she would talk, the people who have been affected by that crime, the residents of that building. You might also talk with housing about that. So those would be the three types of sources I'd advocate for there. You also have to think about how you're going to land that interview and then how do you conduct the interview. And that's what this unit is going to be all about. So remember, stories have to answer the questions of who, what, when, where, why, and how. So when you're preparing for the interview, the first step is trying to figure out what is this story about, and what is the purpose of this story. Is it an investigative piece? Is it a news story? Is it a feature story? Is it a sports story? Is it a listicle? What type of story is this? That will determine how many sources you need and, what you need to do for your interviews. Second of all, once you've decided what the purpose is, you need to decide who you're going to interview. Many of your choices will be obvious, such as the police chief. The ones that might not be would be in that case, like, some of the maybe someone with housing or a victim. That might not be immediately obvious. Too often we always think official source, official source, official source. Well, always keep in mind that the people who are affected by the crime are, as good of sources, if not better sources, than just the police. Number three, when you are figuring out who you want to interview, you need to assess the character of the interviewee. So, what I mean by this is do your research. Be very careful on who you're going to interview. Make sure that that person really has something to add to the story. Make sure that the person does not have an agenda, especially in a story that might have some type of political tone or some type of tone like that. So just make sure that the person you're interviewing is on the up and up. Sometimes people do have an agenda they're trying to shove down our throats. So just make sure that they are who they say they are. You need to figure out what topics you're going to focus on. You need to. I like for beginning reporters to write out their questions because it helps you to kind of get focused and it helps you to have some confidence going into that interview. And you're not going to sit there with a notebook and just ask those questions. You have to then anticipate possible answers to the questions, and it can help you with your planning as well as your follow-up questions. You can't be too scared in an interview just to sit there and take down every word that the person says, and you're just looking down your list. You're like, okay, so next question, and you realize after you ask it, the person's already answered it. So as they're answering the question, write everything down, but then also start to think, is there something that they've said that is now muddy that you need to get it clarified? All right, so let's talk about preparing for the interview. So in all cases, except for breaking news, and even then, you need to research what you're going to be writing about. So if it's something like an ongoing story, you need to go to the library in your newsroom or look through the archives or Google or somewhere and read previous stories. Um, in most cases, read the background material about the subject. So, for instance, if you're covering a school board in a town and they're going to vote to give students laptops, maybe there have been previous stories about that you could read about in, we used to call it a library, sometimes it's called the archives. And so you might find out that 5 years ago they tried this and it didn't pass. Well, why did it pass this time? So you have better background information. That background information can help you to inform your questions that you need to ask. You also might consider talking with other reporters who've covered the story. There may be some underlying issues that you need to know. Oftentimes, especially when you're a general assignment reporter, whether you're on print or broadcast, you are thrown into situations where you don't know the people. You may not know some of the underlying issues. For instance, I covered a lot of school board meetings in one of our counties many, many years ago. And there were always underlying issues with some political back and forth between a certain board member and the superintendent. So whenever I had to tell a new reporter going into that, I'd always clue them in about the personality conflicts between these two, just so the reporter would know. Sometimes also you might need to clue the reporter in to how to address someone. I had some sources who did like to be addressed a certain way. So those types of little nuances. You also need to make sure that you are seeking specific information as you do your research. If you're writing a feature story or a personality profile, a lot of times people will have a biography on their website. So read that. That gives you some clues. It also gives you some questions that you can use kind of in the chit-chat portion of your interview. If you're interviewing someone who is an expert in a subject matter, say like a doctor, you don't want to go in there and ask, so, Dr. Barkley, what's your specialty? Well, you should already know that because you have read the person's biography. Sometimes some people get offended when you don't do your homework. When you are getting ready to do your interview, I like to tell my reporters to call, email, or visit their source to set up the interview. Um, Preferably, you call, you give them a time that works, you all debate a time that works. You have your time to prepare, they have their time to prepare. Breaking news is not going to be that easy. If somebody dodges you and they've dodged your phone calls, their emails, text, anything, you might need to just pay a visit to their office, and then they will actually come into, they can't say no if you are right there. When you start your interview, try to put them at ease with some small talk. And then finally, I say arrive on time and at the specified place. Now,